Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you today to address this audience. I'd just like to mention that September 6, 2013, I believe will go in the history books as a day on which history was changed. This was the day when President Xi Jinping went to Astana at Nazarbayev University and announced the creation of what he called the economic belt, the Silk Road economic belt through Central Asia, from China to Europe, creating a new corridor of development from east to west. A month later, he went to Indonesia, to Jakarta. He was the first foreign leader to address the Indonesian parliament, where he announced also a maritime Silk Road, which would cover the area through Southeast Asia, covering all the major ports to India and thence to Africa. This was a major engineering program, infrastructural investment program, the biggest one we have ever seen in history. It was a shock to the world, but created great hope for many of those countries, particularly the countries in the landlocked areas of Central Asia and the other impoverished areas of Southern Asia and Southeast Asia, which were to benefit from this. It was a shock because in the last few decades, we have been living in the post-Bretton Woods world for most of our lives, for many of you, of course, in all of your lives. When President Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, the economies of many countries went belly up. In particular in Latin America and in Africa, the terms of trade suddenly were shifted to the detriment of their development. And we've been living in that kind of a situation since then. The economies of these nations, which were relatively moving on the road to progress in the early 1970s, have gone from bad to worse. And it's not only the developing countries, although they were hit with this worst of all, but also in Europe and even in the United States, the home of the New York, London financial oligarchies. Great Britain and the United States were also hit. Conditions in this country have gone from bad to worse over the period of the last 40 years. The economy, the physical economy, our ability to produce infrastructure and to create jobs has become smaller and smaller, and the financial bubble, which has been created because of the ability of the financial elites to simply print money, has grown bigger and bigger. This has led to two major crises in the last 30 years, and we have been faced with a period of devastation, which has created a great deal of pessimism throughout the world. There were many efforts to change this. The LaRouche organization has been very much involved since the early 1970s. Lyndon LaRouche made a proposal in 1975 to create an international development bank which could provide credits for infrastructural development in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa. There was also meetings at the Group of 77 in the late 1970s, and finally at the United Nations General Assembly, a friend of Mr. LaRouche, Fred Wills, the Foreign Minister of Guyana, had proposed the creation of such an international development bank and the creation of a new world economic order. But all of these attempts met with failure because the New York financial oligarchy were not going to permit this to happen. And we never had the strength that was needed to push this through, the strength and the agreement between enough nations to push this program through. So things deteriorated at an ever-expanding rate up until the present point. China, however, represented a tremendous surprise because in the 1990s, they entered this system, this New York, London system, as cheap labor producers, as many of the Latin American countries had done as well. China, however, had a program for leapfrogging from the conditions of being a cheap labor producer to becoming a moderately prosperous society by orienting the surplus that they had achieved through their cheap labor production into science and technology and into particular fields of industrial development in which they were intent on becoming the top-notch producers in the world as a whole. And we see the results of some of their progress today in the fact that they have become the major producers of high-speed rail. They are also the third nation to become a spacefaring nation, sending men into space. And this surprised the world because it was like an anomaly in a situation which was characterized by devastation. China, of course, by doing this, became the #1 economic producer in the world, the real engine of the world economy by the present time. And it also placed upon themselves a certain responsibility. They had gone, as a result of that economic development, from being a regional power to a point where they had a responsibility for world development. As the major economic producer, they then had to think of issues which they didn't have to confront at an earlier stage. And for many, this came as something of a surprise and a new situation in which they had to develop a policy, especially a diplomatic policy, in pursuing the relations with the other countries of the world. And China was not intent on following the same mode of operation as the world has seen over the last 2 centuries, where countries that would grow would then think of themselves as the great hegemon controlling all of the world. They knew what that was like because they had been at the bottom of that. They had been under the heel of hegemony of the colonial powers for well over 100 years. So they wanted to chart a new course, a new set of relationships between nations in which everybody would profit. And they tapped much of their ancient history during the course of what they called the revival of China as a major nation. They began looking back at their own philosophical roots, which were based in the works of the great philosopher Confucius and Mencius, who in their days, during the period of a very difficult era for Chinese history where there were warring states fighting each other, the philosophers themselves laid out a policy of how to achieve harmony between nations. And Confucius spent most of his life in going from state to state, trying to get the leaders of these states to understand these rules and this behavior in order to stop the continual war fighting that went on. These are the ideas that have always laid at the basis of Chinese culture through all the transitions that they went through, from the imperial powers in the Qing dynasty through the Republic of Korea up into the present, the People's Republic of China. This Confucian ethic, this Confucian ideas of statesmanship always lay at the basis of much of the thinking. And that was made as they transitioned into a major power. This became the basis for their developing a policy, what President Xi calls a win-win policy, in which China and China's development could benefit the world. What it led to, of course, was this development of the Belt and Road policy. It was a policy, on one hand, of a good neighbor policy. China, the biggest country in the region, knew that they, as they had developed, would cause a certain amount of concern and perhaps even fear among the smaller nations in the region. Therefore, they felt that it was necessary to show concretely to these nations that the power that China had developed economically would also be to their benefit. So that they worked out a policy of being able to use the technological capabilities of China for building up the infrastructure of the other nations, initially of Southeast Asia and of Central Asia, which were their neighboring countries. And they placed this in the context of what was the ancient Silk Road, which was the ancient corridor of development between East and West. They wanted to make a modern Silk Road in which that corridor would now not be a transition or a transmission of silk and spices and things like that, but of technology, of ideas, and also, as the ancient Silk Road, a transmission of cultures. so that you would have, combined with the economic development, a dialogue of cultures between nations, so that each nation and each different ethnic group and national groups could understand much better the way that the other people think, how they do things, and perhaps even benefit and be and enhance their own activity through an understanding of these foreign cultures. It had its roots initially in thinking in two ways. It had roots in China and it had roots in Europe, this Belt and Road policy. In China, by the 1980s, there were already people, economists, who were thinking of developing railroad through the western portion of their region, the Xinjiang region in the west, going into Europe in order to create a single corridor of development that they were working on at that time. Similarly, around the same time, there was the work of the LaRouche organization of Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp LaRouche, who had been involved in developing programs of infrastructural development for Africa, Asia, Latin America, who had also, with the reunification of Germany, worked on a project of developing this new region of East and Western Europe, making it into a productive triangle which could provide high technology capital goods to the rest of the world. And as the wall came down and all these countries from the Soviet Union became independent countries, landlocked most of them, the idea was that they could extend that productive triangle into Central Asia and all the way to China in order to bring these countries into the mainstream of development and create this East-West corridor that could also bring about this combination, this dialogue of cultures. And the two met at a certain point, I think largely through some of the mediation of friends in Russia who were also very much involved in relations with China, who indicated that there was this similar development going on in China. So that Mrs. LaRouche and her Chinese counterparts began discussions around this notion of creating what we then called a Eurasian land bridge, a new Silk Road. This led in 1996 to a major conference in Beijing, where we had encouraged the Chinese government to take the point on this idea and to become the central focus in which we could bring the other countries of the world around this notion of infrastructural development based on this new creation of connectivity through the development initially of railroads, but also more and more the development of high-speed railroads between Europe and Asia. And they were amenable to this. They held this conference. Mrs. LaRouche was invited as an honored guest and gave a speech at the conference. You even had some representatives from the European Union who were somewhat skeptical about it, but came kicking and screaming to this conference because the Chinese felt that they should be there. But that really put the marker in the sand. We put out a report in 1996 with all the presentations at that particular conference, and we circulated that throughout the world. We circulated that throughout the United States and all the government layers here in the U.S. as well as in Europe. So this idea was percolating. It did not lead to a major campaign on the part of the Chinese government for two particular reasons. The conference was in 1996, and in 1997 you had a major crisis in the Asia region, the Asian financial crisis. China was concentrating at that time on trying to do what it could to alleviate the crisis by maintaining the value of the RMB, by not devaluing where all the other countries' currencies were being devalued as a result of the crisis. And in that way, they helped these other nations to come to their feet. And then not too many years later, in the 2008 crisis, there was a second, even bigger crisis, which comprised all of the world. So there was a very difficult economic climate. But China continued to move forward on their economic policy. And by the end of the 2008 crisis, they were in a situation where they could present a major program of development. This led, of course, to President Xi's going to Kazakhstan, where he had worked with the leader of Kazakhstan, President Nazarbayev, to develop this Silk Road economic belt concept. And that changed the nature of the game economically worldwide. What had been this growth of pessimism suddenly for those nations on the Belt and Road became a tremendous sense, created a tremendous sense of optimism that things would move forward, that they would become a part of the mainstream of international commerce, and that goods would flow continually. Goods and people would flow continually between East and West, increasing trade and increasing development. This has not been limited, of course, only to China. Many of the other countries that initially did not consider themselves a part of the Belt and Road in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America, then saw the possibilities. They saw the example of China, which was a most impoverished country in the 1970s. It looked like every other developing sector country. In some cases, it was even worse in terms of the conditions there. And this country suddenly, over a period of a couple of decades, had blossomed into the most important country in the world. This showed what could be done under the correct policies, so that everybody became interested in this, and everybody suddenly found the courage and the optimism to try and move in that same direction. After the announcement of the Belt and Road, Mrs. LaRouche went back to China to get an idea of what the thinking was now that President Xi had initiated this program. After the announcement, she had mandated that we give out a new report on the Silk Road Economic Belt, which would update and enhance and add the new things that had happened since the original report that we had given out from this 1996 conference. And we went back with this report, which was called "The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge," because it was clear in our eyes that this project, which China had initiated, would become the model for global development. And we showed the report to our Chinese colleagues, and they were ecstatic. They did the work to translate this quickly into Chinese and to make this available to Chinese scholars really as a template for what they thought that the Chinese scholars should do. Nowadays, of course, you have many reports on the Belt and Road, but this was really the first report done by non-Chinese scholars to explain the significance of the Belt and Road, and is today even considered the most important report on the project because it was so far-seeing in that. When Mrs. LaRouche went back, of course, she was greeted as the Silk Road Lady. This was an epithet she had received really in Europe, because from 1997 until 2013, she and under the Schiller Institute, which she is the president of and founder, had held hundreds of conferences all over the world on the Silk Road project, even before President Xi announced the Belt and Road in Astana. And so in one sense, people understood that that was the source, ultimately, of what this Belt and Road was. So she returned and received a hero's welcome. The report has since been translated into Arabic. It's being translated into Korean. It represents a tremendous amount of hope, especially in the Middle East, where as the wars tend to come down, as ISIL is defeated, it's not defeated yet, but it's received some serious blows. These problems will not be resolved unless we have a major program of economic development in that region. And the Silk Road is that development. In fact, there was a conference just a few weeks ago with representatives from Syria and the Chinese, which was called "Syria is on the Silk Road." And this is what they say, what they see, that this is the hope that they have of trying to create the economic conditions in this devastated part of the world to give the young people hope that they can do something with their lives, that it represents a meaning, that they can develop their own capabilities and become engineers or scientists or poets to contribute to the development of humanity rather than throwing themselves on the scrap heap through terrorist activities and so-called sacrifice that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIL has been recruiting them to. With the conditions that exist today, there is no hope. With the Belt and Road, they get the hope. So what we're seeing is, of course, that we have a new paradigm in world history. Mrs. LaRouche most recently was invited to the very prestigious Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, which was called for by President Xi himself. You had over 100 countries that were represented, including heads of state and heads of government. But in addition, they wanted to invite all the major think tanks and associations that somehow had contributed to this Silk Road project. And of course, Mrs. LaRouche, more than anybody else, of course, had done most for that. So she also was a VIP guest at this conference. So it's moving forward. There is really no stopping it. It can be a program for development for the entire world if we can create an understanding within the United States and within Western Europe of the importance of this project. Because here also there is a need for infrastructure. The European nations have suffered as well as the developing sector countries. If you look at the countries, I know of Spain and Portugal, some of you are on the webcast here, you see what the devastation was caused by the 2008 crisis. That is not over. We still have a failed financial system which has to be changed. We have to get rid of a large amount of the outstanding debt in order to create the capabilities for new credits for development. This is what China is trying to do. When President Xi went to Jakarta in 2013, he also announced that they were going to create an infrastructure development bank. That bank has been created, the AIIB, which is an international bank initiated by China, but is an international development bank which is now financing infrastructure in many countries of the world, not simply Belt and Road countries, but in Africa, Asia, and in Latin America. And in addition to that, through the BRICS, very important BRICS cooperation, this has also been expanded to the new development bank. These two institutions, while they don't represent the major funding that's needed in terms of infrastructure, and it's really trillions of dollars that is required, they do not have that capability, but they have set a model. They have set a model by insisting that any money that is given out in credit will not go to financing speculative boondoggles, will not go to paying off old debt, but it will go simply to creating infrastructure, creating the physical capabilities which will assure the credibility of the loans that are given. That must be the model of the world economy. And we have work to do in that respect in trying to change the way the financial system works by revamping it from the bottom up, by replacing the system of the so-called free market with the system of directed credits for industry. In the United States, we call this the Hamiltonian system. It's also been associated with the economist Friedrich List. We've got to go back to that, and in doing that, we have to convince the Europeans and the United States that they must go along with this Silk Road economic belt. Here in the United States, we have got to see that President Trump, who has committed himself, at least in words, to a program of infrastructure and to a reestablishment of a bank separation, that is, moving against the Wall Street banks by creating a separation between commercial banks that are financing the physical infrastructure and the investment banks which are conducting pure speculation. There has to be a firewall so that these banks cannot take control of grandma's money as they have been doing over the past 10 years, and that all the savings that is created will go to the development of infrastructure. So the idea of this Belt and Road represents what Mrs. LaRouche has called a new paradigm for humanity. The geopolitics of the old day, in which it was a win-lose situation, I win, you lose, or you win and I lose, has got to be abolished. We have to have a situation in which there is a mutual benefit, that the things that I do in cooperation with you or independently of you must also go to benefit you. Similarly, what you do must also go to benefit me. There has got to be this mutual agreement, mutual benefit in international relations. And that means that we have to eliminate war as a solution. We have to go back to the ideas that Franklin Roosevelt had when he created the United Nations. We no longer go to war with each other, because war can lead to total devastation, especially during the nuclear period. And problems that nations have to be resolved by finding in the relationship between those nations the common interest, which can be realized through a collaborative effort. So what I would like to leave you with at this point is a message of optimism. The old world as we have known it, the post-Bretton Woods system, is over. The new system is represented by development, by this idea of infrastructural investment. The world has united around this. 100 countries went to the Belt and Road Forum. 100 countries have said, we want to move in that direction and away from that direction that we have been going. And the outliers at this point, including the United States and even some of the more skittish nations in Europe, have got to understand that this has got to be the direction that we're going. And if we move in that direction, we can create the greatest period of development for all mankind. This will lead, to elimination of poverty. China has already brought 700 million people out of poverty over 2 decades. It has shown that we can eliminate poverty. We no longer just say it, we will have the means to do it. And secondly, it will create a tremendous flourishing of culture in which people in the West and people in the East can learn the best parts of each of their countries. As the Chinese talk about it, the Belt and Road program is China going to the West, and it's the West going to the East. And we must meet together around this program of common development in order to create prosperity for future generations. And I think we can do it.